Ask the President of Finland a question, please.
Okay. We have this sort of large Western alliance, which the United States is leading.
I know that there are questions here in Europe about the future of America's role.
The United States is committed to Finland, committed to NATO, and those commitments are rock solid.
Esteemed chargé d'affaires Mr. Kraft, hyvät ystävät, kära vänner, dear friends. My name is Victor Andersson, and on behalf of Hanaholmen, the Swedish-Finnish Cooperation Center, I have the great pleasure to welcome you to this extremely topical discussion on the Nordics and the new era of transatlantic relations. Please bear with me for a few important practicalities regarding security on site here at Hanaholmen. There are 3 emergency exits from this auditorium, 2 on your right side, up and down, and then 1 here on the left side of the stage. The gathering place in case of an emergency is on the parking lot in front of the main entrance. There is a green sign indicating the exact location, and if there is a need to alert help, please contact the reception on the ground floor or someone of us organizers. It has been remarkable to note how thoroughly the US election has been covered in Sweden and Finland. Since many weeks, the morning news have started with an update on what has happened during the night in the presidential campaigns. During my time here at Hanaholmen, we have covered the Swedish parliamentary election and the Finnish presidential election with special events. It feels therefore most natural that we have this discussion tonight. Nevertheless, we do not have the 2 main candidates here, but we have 3 experts with extensive knowledge in US politics and international relations. They will focus on the role of foreign policy, especially transatlantic relations, in the election campaign, while also looking beyond November 5th to the years and decades ahead. We will discuss whether Finland and Sweden's NATO membership has brought about a new era of transatlantic relations in the Nordic foreign policy and reflect on what we can expect from transatlantic relations under the next administration. I would like to express my great appreciation to the Ulkopolitist for the initiative and the excellent cooperation. We would also like to thank the US Embassy for supporting this project, the Transatlantic, which also includes podcasts which delve deeper into the subject. We have an extremely exciting discussion to look forward to. Now it is my great pleasure and honor to invite to the stage Christopher Kraft, Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Helsinki, to give his opening remarks. Please.
Good afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's really an honor to be able to speak with you here today. And thank you, Victor, and thank you to the Ulkopolitist for the invitation, to Hanaholmen for organizing this event. I also look forward to hearing from the panelists. Joel, Laura, Alexandra are astute observers of the U.S. political scene, so I look forward to hearing what to expect tomorrow. As a career apolitical Foreign Service officer, I will not be making any predictions here tonight. So, but I will sit in the back here and listen. And just so you're clear, in case I need to get up in the middle of someone's comments, it will not be a nonverbal commentary. But I do have to step out for another event that starts at 4:30. You may have seen, if you came in from town, we have a guided missile cruiser that came into port this weekend, and so we're doing something on the USS Gettysburg at Hernesaari, so I'll have to step out. Anyways, let me start by addressing the elephant, or perhaps the donkey, for those of you who know US political party animal mascots in the room. Tomorrow, more than 160 million Americans will have cast and have counted their votes for our next US president. Now, I don't profess to have any special skills to foresee who the American people will elect to sit in the White House come January 20th, but elections and the peaceful transition of power are essential to a functioning democracy. In the United States, our system of government enshrines the rule of law and strives to protect the equality and dignity of all individuals. Democracy is at the core of who we are, and tomorrow we'll witness an inclusive process where democracy will have rallied millions of voices and perspectives, all striving to build a society and government that serves its people in a way they see best. Of course, democracy is a continuous and never-ending journey toward forming that more perfect union established as a goal in our nation's foundational documents. The democratic process is certainly not without its flaws, but it allows for self-correction and growth, as seen in historic strides in the United States, for example, to strengthen civil rights and the expansion of voting rights. With tomorrow's uncertainty as a backdrop, I can say one thing for certain. I firmly believe the strength of the US-Finnish cooperation will transcend any electoral outcome in the United States. The United States and Finland, through our leaders, institutions, and people-to-people connections, have forged deepening ties and have cultivated a partnership based on shared values, mutual respect, and a steadfast commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Just in the last 2 years, from Finland's NATO accession to the signing of a defense cooperation agreement, from the soon-to-be-signed Icebreaker Collaboration Effort, or IcePact MOU, which hopefully will be signed next week, to the myriad other MOUs that have increased our bilateral economic cooperation, our countries at every level continue to strengthen our friendship and partnership, not only for tomorrow, but for decades to come. Finland's accession to NATO also highlighted our shared determination to safeguard peace, security, and stability in the face of current and future challenges. Let's not forget the US Senate's 95-1 vote in favor of Finnish accession to NATO in 2023, which I see as a pretty good barometer of the overwhelmingly clear and dominant bipartisan commitment to a strong alliance between the United States, NATO, and Finland. These shared commitments form the bedrock of our relationship and transcend any one leader or party. Perhaps out of an ingrained instinct to prepare for any possible outcome, Finland has also carefully, and in some ways uniquely, positioned itself to be ready to work with whomever is elected to serve as the next president of the United States. Finnish officials and institutions have welcomed and met with US congressional delegations, with members from both sides of the US political aisle, forging valuable connections, and further underscoring that our partnership is built on enduring principles. These bonds are strong and will guide our nations toward a future of continued cooperation and shared success. On January 20th, 2025, when the next president of the United States will be inaugurated, from our standpoint at the US Embassy in Helsinki, it will be business as usual, with the United States and Finland continuing to work together to further our shared goals and face the challenges ahead side by side. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to hearing the insights from our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Hyvää iltapäivää. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to give one more warm welcome. All right, any better? For the fifth time, welcome everyone to our event today. My name is Ulla Henttonen, and I am an editor for North America for the Ulkopoliittist. I'm also a PhD candidate at Tampere University and a sworn transatlantist myself. I have recently returned from a Fulbright scholarship in Washington, D.C., and I am definitely one of the most excited people here to follow tomorrow's outcome. We are excited to have an interesting panel today with expert speakers, but before we get to that, a few words on why we decided to talk about the topic we are covering today. So we have, of course, seen different eras in foreign policy, different trends and kind of turning tides. For a long time, Finland's foreign policy was largely defined by our relationship with our eastern neighbor, the Soviet Union, back in the day. And once the Cold War era drew to an end, Finland turned to Europe. We joined the European Union, we became part of the Eurozone, we built a strong cooperation with our neighbors in the Nordics, and then of course now, in recent years, for reasons that are partially obvious and that we'll be discussing much more during today, we've seen a new shift. Finland joined the NATO, we signed a bilateral defense agreement with the United States, and last year the United States became our largest export partner. So in many ways it does seem like we are closer to the United States than we have ever been. And while Finnish NATO membership got a very strong mandate from the public opinion a couple of years ago, it hasn't gone without its critics as well. So we've heard some NATO skeptics even talk about a new era of Finlandization, where Finland is tying itself again to a new superpower. So we're going to have some big questions to pose to our panel today. But that's something we like to do at the Ulkopoliittista. So at the Ulkopoliittista, our mission is to drive better foreign policy discourse. We have over 100 writers and editors covering practically all areas of foreign and security policy and all areas of the world as well. So what we have on the agenda today is, of course, also excellent foreign policy discourse. I will give it up to my co-host and colleague Anton to introduce himself and our panelists, and then we get to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ulla. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again from my part as well. So glad to see all of you here today as we get ready to discuss this most topical subject, the new transatlantic dimension for the Nordic countries. My name is Anton Engelberg. I'm a writer for the Europe section of the Ulkopoliittista. I'm passionate about Nordic cooperation and transatlantic relations, so this is very much my cup of tea, this event. Was an exciting occasion with the US presidential elections, just one more night's sleep away, or two, depending on where you'll be watching. This is, of course, the culminating point for the entire super election year of 2024. And what a nail-biter it looks like to be. The two main candidates are neck and neck within the margin for error, right to the finish line. In football terms, that's soccer, by the way, for our American friends. It looks like the game-winning goal in extra time might need to be checked on video. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our hosts this afternoon, the Hanaholmen Cooperation and Cultural Center for Sweden and Finland. Thank you for inviting us to your wonderful premises to speak at the eve of this consequential event. Just next week, the President of the European Commission will speak at these very premises at the Hanaholmen Initiative Summit, where Finland and Sweden are inviting experts to discuss a new European comprehensive security model. Please also extend a heartfelt thank you to the US Embassy in Finland for supporting this event and the preceding The Transatlantic podcast series, which is available for listening on Spotify and via the Ulkopoliittista website. Now, ladies and gentlemen, bear with me just one more practicality before we welcome our panelists. You have submitted several questions for them in advance. Thank you very much for this. In case you think of new questions, we are using the interactive presentation platform Mentimeter. We'll be putting the event code up on the screen here. And to transmit your real-time comments and questions to the panelists, you can go to the menti.com website on the web browser of your mobile device and type in the code. Ulla and I will be monitoring the questions, ready to put them forward to the panelists. Although this event is held in English, feel free to submit your questions in your own language. Vi kommer med Ulla att vid behov översätta era frågor. Kysymykset voi siis esittää hyvin myös suomeksi. Without further ado, please welcome our panelists on stage. Joel Linnamäki from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Alexandra Pasternak-Jackson, CEO of AmCham Finland, and Laura Saarikoski from Tampere University. Welcome. Our expert panelists' various backgrounds make for a great discussion on the topic of the new transatlantic dimension of the Nordic countries. Joel Linnamäki is a research fellow in the Finnish Foreign Policy, Northern European Security and NATO Research Program. His recent work has explored US-Finnish negotiations for a DCA agreement, Finland's NATO membership debate, and foreign policy schools of thought. Previously, Linnamäki has worked as special advisor to Finnish Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto in 2019 to 2023, in the Finnish Parliament and in various civil society organizations. He holds a graduate degree from University of Helsinki, where his thesis focused on the Finnish NATO membership debate in the Parliament in 2022. He is currently a doctoral researcher in world politics at the University of Helsinki, focusing on European security order and NATO expansion.
I just want to note that I think this is more information than my mom knows, so thank you for the introduction.
Wow, that's good to know, Alexandra Pasternak-Jackson, the CEO of AmCham Finland since 2018, a dual citizen of Finland and the United States. She has 20 years of transatlantic business experience. I'm hoping I'm getting the calculations right. Working to promote international business and foreign direct investment to Finland, as well as providing opportunities and networks for Finnish companies heading to the US market. Alexandra is a frequent public speaker and moderator, addressing senior leadership audiences in both the United States and Finland, on topics ranging from foreign direct investment and the transatlantic economy to networking and transformational leadership topics. Laura Saarikoski's career in journalism began nearly 30 years ago in 1995 as journalist for Helsingin Sanomat newspaper. She worked in various editorial roles at Helsingin Sanomat, leading the news desk as editor-in-chief, managing editor and supervisor. In addition, she has served as Washington correspondent and political journalist. She received the Bonnier Grand Prize for Journalism in the Journalist of the Year category in 2017 for her coverage of the 2016 US presidential elections. She also co-authored a book on Donald Trump and America, together with her husband Saska Saarikoski. She began her tenure as Professor of Practice of Journalism at Tampere University in August 2024. In a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are in expert company to be covering this topic. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. Let's get started with a few questions that we like to call, how well do we know each other? So now, kind of during the lead up to the election, we've once again been reminded of how everyone really seems to like to have an opinion about American politics and the United States overall. And now that this partnership is getting to be so close and so important for Finland, the question is kind of, do we really understand the United States as well as we'd like to, and also vice versa? So the first question goes to you, Laura. Generally speaking, in your opinion, why are we so obsessed with the American election? Why are we hosting an event like this that we wouldn't necessarily have during the lead up to a German election or a French election, or have views that are more passionate than most of us Finns have about our own sote-vaalit or well-being county elections? Is it just because the impact is so big, or is it really more because it's just these elections make for good entertainment?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's nice to be here today. In Helsingin Sanomat, when I was working there, we got asked this question a lot. There were lots of readers who complained that we do not cover the European elections as extensively, not the African elections. But to be honest, I mean, US elections are far more interesting to readers than any other elections, apart from the Finnish elections. And the reason why they interest people is that they are so important. I mean, United States is the only superpower of the world, let's face it. And what happens there affects our economy, our security, and basically our future. So they have a huge impact. And then, of course, they are great entertainment too. Finns know English well, they are able to follow it. It's almost like a little bit of a horse race thing that you can, have a discussion online, you can bet on it. So it is very important, it interests people, and it is a great show.
Next one goes to you, Alexandra. Some things that we take for granted here in the Nordic countries look completely different from the US perspective. To some Americans, what we consider welfare societies can look like government overreach, and what may look to us like a harsh dog-eat-dog environment can also be viewed as individual freedoms and appreciation of hard work. The same applies to foreign policy. The realities of a small state can be hard to relate to from a superpower perspective. In your view, what is a particular type of misunderstanding or difference in perspective that poses a challenge for the Nordic-American relations?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, first of all. And second of all, that's a big question. I think I'll highlight three big differences that you see in at least business and quite often can be found in various areas of statecraft. So firstly, in the US, there is a political rallying cry that is actually bipartisan, and that is freedom from tyranny. Does anyone know who tyranny represents in this equation? You can shout it out, be interactive. Tyranny is government. Freedom from tyranny, which is a political rallying cry across the aisle, represents government. And this, it comes from the American Revolution. It comes from an oppressive and tyrannical British crown that has become part of American philosophy. I'm thinking about John Locke, thinking about Montesquieu, who influenced early American leaders. So basically, ideals of self-government, individual liberties, and resistance to oppression is this fundamental belief in a mistrust of government overreach. Now in Finland, we have the exact opposite, because in Finland, government represents freedom to. It's not freedom from, it's freedom to live our lives, to have healthcare and education. And that is a fundamental difference in the way citizens relate to the people they are voting into office. And I think that is not raised enough. The other thing that I think is absolutely critical when you're making decisions transatlantically is the view to risk. And this is really relevant in our foreign policy discussions. Americans, when they look at risk-taking, they will take risks for the upside. They will take risks with a vision of the win, the positive reason you take that risk. But often in Finland, when you are discussing these things, big risks are taken to avoid abject failure. So you take the risk to ensure that you don't fail. Versus often in the US, when you talk about big risks, you take it for the win. And the fail is just something that might happen. And those two big differences, this freedom from tyranny, freedom to, versus risk management, how you take risks, really impact business, but also impact the way our governments relate to each other. And the last point, because I promised you three, the last point that I think is often underappreciated in Finland is the sheer size of the United States of America, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of people. When we talk about in Finland, different political parties or different areas of the country, we need to agree with each other. We are 5.5 million people in this country versus the US, which is 350 million people. You can definitely find 5.5 million Americans that believe the same way, that want to run the country the same way. And so I think those three differences, the sheer size that's sometimes misunderstood, and that relates to the US being a superpower as well. Because the US can't possibly understand what it is like to be a small country navigating great power competition. It's immensely more complicated. So those are the 3 points that I'd highlight. And I saw Laura had a response to that, which excited me.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I recently read Colin Woodard's book that got published in 2011, and he actually describes 11 different cultures within the United States and sort of divides them by the way that the immigration waves during a history, what kind of a relationship they had to the government. So basically in the North and Northeast, people are more pro-government than in the South for various different reasons. And that also creates sort of the difference between the parties, and that relationship to government, the dislike or the relative like of the government actually explains very well which part of the country votes for Democrats and Republicans even nowadays. It's fascinating. Of course, Donald Trump has muddled the waters a little bit because the populist, being a populist Republican, he cannot have and won't have as negative of an image of a government because many of the white Republican supporters of him now rely on government welfare. So it has it's not so clear-cut anymore. But I recommend everybody who wants to understand the internal differences of the US and its different states towards the government to get acquainted with Woodard's book.
Thank you so much. As you can tell, we are not posing any easy questions here today. So, Joel, I hope you're bracing yourself for yours. Two of the big things that seem to be present both in this election, but also in foreign policy and international relations largely are populism and polarization. And those two phenomena are, of course, in no way uniquely American. Are there any parallels that you see between European or Nordic strains of populism and those in North America? Or are there maybe some key differences that make those fundamentally different?
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of differences and points of agreement, but I'm going to start by slightly complementing what Alexander very well put out here by saying that one difference, of course, when it comes to foreign policy or in this perspective that the US has and that we have as a small country is that they have global interests and we have local interests or regional interests, even though probably in an alliance of 32 countries, which is NATO, it's not ideal to only look at your own immediate neighborhood. But that's the way it is for a small country. Oftentimes, your resources and bandwidth are limited, and you are forced to look at what's happening around you. And as Finns, of course, we're always interested in what other people think about us and how they're talking about us. But the truth is that for a country the size of the United States, they often don't think about it at all. And most times, they are not thinking about us. Right now, of course, there's still increased awareness and interest towards Finland due to our NATO membership process, but that's fading away because they have a lot of different things on their plate and everybody is trying to get their attention to their own issues and problems and interests. And that's why it's so crucial that we not only as one country of 5.6 million people here in the far Nordic end of Europe try to engage with the US, but do that together jointly with other Nordic countries and try to have a joint approach. But when it comes to populism, which was this polarization, which was the actual question, maybe one thing that I have been keeping one eye on is the connection between the European populists in the style of Viktor Orban and the Republican Party of Donald Trump and what they're trying to maybe imitate parts of the playbook and try to copy parts of the playbook and import it into the US. But it's kind of it will be interesting to see if Trump is reelected, how that might affect politics in Europe and what Orban will try to import here as well. And I want to finish this long monologue by saying that somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago if Alexander Stubb will be the Trump whisperer if he's elected. I was like, no, I think Europe has one Trump whisperer already, and that's Orban. And that's the sad truth. But
and a role we're not eager to steal away from him.
I think it would be a bit difficult at this point. Yeah.
Alexandra and Laura, would you like to weigh in on this matter as well, or?
Well, in 2016, when during Trump's first win, there were lots of Americans who sort of apologized to me that they have a presidential candidate who uses that kind of a quite rogue language about Europeans and foreigners in general. And I reminded them that actually populism was popular in Europe first, that at that time we already had major populist parties in many of the European countries, so it was not an American phenomenon that got transported into Europe, but the other way around. So we all know it's in its different forms. And I have to say, from a media's perspective, of course, media has actually worsened the polarization on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially in the United States because of the digital logic of sort of the more threat and fear you put in a headline, the more it gets clicks. So this was especially visible during a 2016 election when the major media in the United States actually made a headline of every single Trump tweet, which got it a lot of new readership, huge volumes of viewers, and actually media was doing, and media business was doing greatly in 2016. But then, of course, when the media realized that it actually led partly led to the win of President Trump, I think there's been a little bit of a hesitancy and more of a sort of a context building at this time.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at those similarities, building off what you're saying, you can also look at your personal algorithms when you're consuming news online. And often your algorithms in social media and news feeds, you know, they build on each other, which means you get a very personalized echo chamber. It's very hard to get outside of that. You know, if I Googled the exact same thing as Laura, we might get completely different results based on our previous search results and the assumptions that the technology is making about who we are as people. And that's a phenomenon that we've seen, especially in these last 2-3 elections coming up. And that's something that, in terms of polarization, has had an extremely negative effect because it's very hard nowadays to understand and get access to the other side's perspective without your own bias being put on top because of the way that the algorithms are set up. So it's hard to go outside of that bubble for everybody. And then the other thing is the rural versus urban divide is, you know, when we talk about US elections, for a long time, it was just the state by state comparisons and, you know, which states are Democrat states, which states are Republican states. But now we're seeing more and more that the rural versus urban divide in the US plays a significant role because this election isn't just a US presidential election. We're also electing senators and congressmen and city council members and school board members. And all of that plays a much bigger role, well, not a bigger, much bigger, but a significant role in sort of how the US elections impact Finland. And here in Finland, we also see that same phenomenon in terms of rural versus urban divide and also the echo chambers that people utilize in terms of news consumption.
Ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, that was only the warming up. Now we're moving on to the next round, which is headlined Security and Defense. The global security landscape of 2024 looks grim. Large-scale war is happening in Ukraine and the Middle East, and on top of those, local and regional conflicts continue to drag on for years and sometimes decades. And less than surprisingly, as the biggest military power in the world, the United States plays many different roles in these conflicts. As the result of the war in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden found their way into NATO. But the question everyone's asking now is, what will the US role in NATO look like after this election? And how much will the election outcome affect this? My question goes to you, Joel. Ahead of the US elections now, one of the pressing questions is the future of NATO. How significant do you see the risk of isolationist policies returning, or the US even withdrawing from NATO? What could we do here in Europe to prevent this or ensure that the US remains committed to European security, especially now that conflicts and geopolitical tensions demand US attention practically all around the world?
Okay, I have a lot of points, so I'm going to break it up by starting from somewhere and seeing where I end up, and then let the others answer, and then maybe coming back to it after that, so I don't take up all the time. So I'm going to start by building on the previous question and the previous section, which is leading into this, I think, because if you think about European decision-making when it comes to security and defense, it has been surprisingly functional despite the rise of populism inside the European Union, by which I mean we have in a number of countries, populists are in government, in Sweden, in Finland, in Italy, they're leading the government. And in a number of different governments, they're also opposing or opposed to some of the key decisions as it comes to, for example, the Ukraine aid. And despite all these limitations, the European Union has been surprisingly united on the key questions. I personally think we're lacking in vision still and funding for major defense initiatives, but I will come back to that later. But this is just to begin. And then when it comes to the big picture after the US election, I think there's two things that are important to note. First is that the difference, one key difference between the previous US election and this one is that a lot has changed in Europe as well. We have made historical decisions when it comes to Ukraine aid. A number of EU countries are investing in their defense in a way that we have not seen since the Cold War. And basically the whole way of speaking about defense and security matters has changed. There's still a lot that should be done in many countries such as Germany, but the fact that Germans and Germany are talking about defense at all in a way that's not focused on budget cuts to their defense forces and their army is amazing in retrospect, and of course it's caused by the war. And the other thing that has of course changed is that the US focus on Europe is slowly shifting towards Asia, regardless of what happens in this specific election, and this has been happening for a long time. But what I think is kind of interesting also is that this is not something that began with Obama's Asia pivot, for example, but even Nixon in his day was talking about the rise of Asia and the need to focus on Asia and need for Europeans to do more. So this is a very long marathon that we've seen. And then I want to finish by saying that when it comes to NATO as such, I think that there are a number of key questions that are priorities for the US, regardless of the next administration, and of course for Trump specifically if he's elected, mainly China and focus on competition with China, trade imbalances and developing certain technologies, holding supremacy in certain key fields of the economy and technology, and then immigration, of course, which is a big election topic. And these will take a lot of bandwidth in Washington, regardless who is elected. But of course, we know that if Trump is elected, there will be a certain hostile style which will reflect. And then after they have focused on many of these issues, I think, Ukraine pops up somewhere there. I'm not going to name any numbers, what is the level of priority there, but only after Ukraine might come NATO and what to do with NATO allies. So it's not a number one priority. It will come up. There will be issues if Trump is elected, but it's not a number one thing that they're going to deal on day one. Yeah, that was it.
Do you want to comment, or shall we add one more question to the long list that Anton already spelled out? Because I think, Joel, you already previously touched on kind of a related question or point that this NATO membership is a really big deal for Finland and Sweden. It has affected us, kind of our mentality, and of course it has affected our defense politics. But is it that big a deal for the Americans? What's kind of the reaction? First, we of course saw a lot of excitement, a lot of attention directed at the Nordics. Is that fading away, or do we really think this is a shift also from the US perspective? Laura, what do you think?
Well, I was actually quite surprised in the summer when I spent a month in the US that so many ordinary Americans knew that Finland and Sweden had joined NATO. I went to the countryside in Pennsylvania and talked to some people, and I didn't expect them to know really where Finland is, and they knew about the NATO membership. They didn't know the details, but they knew about the NATO membership, and that, I think, was positive. But from the US perspective, of course, I mean, it's not about Finland and Sweden per se, it's about strengthening NATO's northern flank and also about the Baltic Sea becoming like an internal sea really for NATO. And then secondly, it sort of gave the United States a political victory over Putin, being able to say that, see what happened, you attacked Ukraine, and what you got Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and the US and the West being sort of a more united than ever. So United States sees it, of course, from the perspective of how Finland and Sweden's membership makes NATO as a whole stronger. And as you know, Finland has a sort of a strong ground forces and artillery, and then Sweden has submarines. So that adds nicely to the alliance. And also, well, I cannot say that it sort of lessens the pressure on US investment, because US investment to NATO is so huge, but at least it gives much more operating capabilities to United States in the north of Europe.
Yes, and yes, and building on that is also Arctic strategy and Arctic access, something that the U.S. has been looking for many years. I don't think it's a coincidence that we now have a U.S. Arctic ambassador who's stationed in Tromsø. You know, the Arctic front, especially with the changes in climate change, are something that are a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term strategy when it comes to U.S. involvement with Finland, but also with NATO. But also, I think Finland is a well-recognized, how should I say it, good member. You know, we are a net contributor to NATO, which is a good example for other European countries who otherwise also trust Finland in other contexts to follow. So it's really a win-win from a U.S. perspective to have Finland in NATO. And you know, when Trump was traveling around during his first presidency, and he was traveling around Europe, and he was telling everyone, "You've got to get your defense spending up. You know, we're not going to be interested in NATO if you don't contribute, you don't get your defense spending up." And you know, here comes Finland with it already up. And I think regardless of how the elections go, that is something that has left a very positive impression in the minds of Americans, and that has been widely reported on as well.
So clearly the West appears to be getting stronger, and that's a win for the US as well, vis-a-vis kind of this geopolitical landscape. But how does that then, going back to our initial question here, does that mean that we are tying ourselves very close to the United States? Do we risk a new era of Finlandization, now just to the opposite direction?
I object to you tying those questions together because NATO is not just the United States. I mean, NATO is a large grouping of countries that we now belong to, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I think what we are seeing is an era of cooperation and understanding between like-minded countries who want to focus on things like technology development and who want to focus on things like defense cooperations and research and development agreements. These things will push the innovation possibilities for Finland farther ahead than they could with any other country we could partner with.
Is anyone willing to play devil's advocate?
Well, I sort of object to the comparison as well, because Finlandization was sort of it was an approach to contain Soviet Union as much as Finland could at the time, sort of, to get along with the Soviet Union. We did not apply to become a part of Soviet Union. It was the other way around. We fought against it, whereas we applied to become a part of NATO, as did many of the other European nations after the Cold War. So the comparison doesn't quite hold.
I want to start by referring to what Laura very well said before about U.S. knowledge about Finland's NATO membership, because some people might remember that I think some months ago there was a TikTok trend on a conspiracy theory that Finland doesn't exist as a country, and this was in the US, that it's a fishing area for the Japanese, and there's just a hole in the map. So that's the level of knowledge that some people have. But of course, as Alexandra said, you can find 5.6 million people in the US who believe anything because it's such a large country.
Also, I will say that conspiracy theory has been going around since the 70s, and if you want to go down an internet rabbit hole, you should look at the history of that.
Yeah, that's true.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, a very good point. But this was on the lighter side, so as a light note. But when it comes to are we tying ourselves to the United States, if we forget the word Finlandization, as Laura here like very well put, why? Yeah, exactly. It's also like Joel, doesn't matter. We are tying ourselves to the United States, not in the sense of Finlandization, as Laura said here, but what's the alternative here? That there is no alternative. Our NATO membership was forced by the changes in our security environment, which is the war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive foreign policies and security policy. The United States is the predominant security enabler and actor in Europe, and hopefully will remain so for a very, very long time, and has been since the Second World War. But this is not, I'm not saying this in a negative sense. the United States is a very different actor from a lot of different superpowers or great powers such as China or Russia. NATO is, as Laura also said, an alliance of the willing. Countries apply to be NATO members, and there is a lot of disagreement between the allies, including between European allies and the United States, and that has always been the case since the founding of NATO. That doesn't mean the fact that we are tying ourselves to the United States doesn't mean that we can't disagree on things. That's to an extent expected by the Americans, who have a very vibrant democratic process and discussion themselves, so to say.
Yeah, I also think it's important to note the economic equation here as well. I mean, the relationship between the United States and Europe represents 16 million jobs and a third of global GDP in terms of purchasing power. But between Finland, in 2020, sorry, I don't know why I did that. In 2023, Finland's biggest export partner for the second consecutive year was the U.S. And if you compare it to other major, let's say, purchasing countries, China is our 5th largest. So the US is our largest. They are buying our goods, our services. We look at the state of our economy today, and selling our goods to the US, investing in the US, and encouraging American investment in Finland is sort of the fastest track we have to grow the economic situation that we're in a positive way.
Before I allow you to, Laura, comment once more, it is absolute music to my ears to hear you rebut this provocative question around Finlandization, and I hope the audience member who asked the question is also happy to hear your comments. But go ahead, Laura.
This is not to say that there could not be negative consequences of Finland joining NATO. Of course, there could be. If I remind you of the Iraq War, for example, Estonia sent quite a few soldiers that were killed in Iraq. I believe around 100 were killed at the time, during the Iraq War and its aftermath. And when people say that as a NATO member you can choose whether you to send your soldiers into these kind of operations that might be led by the United States in the future, we don't know what they will be. Of course, it's true on paper that you can choose. Many of the European countries chose not to send their soldiers. But as a new NATO member, I'm just wondering whether Finland could actually reject a request made by the United States to join an operation that would be politically unpopular in Finland. Because as a new NATO member, and Finland being the way it's always a dutiful student and always wanting to follow the rules, I would feel that Finland and the politicians would feel very pressured to actually send Finnish soldiers even to operations that wouldn't sort of drive our own security interest first, because we would want to show that we are a good NATO ally, and in return would then hope that the United States will help us in the future. So there are those kind of risks.
Yeah, I just want to add that I completely agree with Laura. Alliances operate on solidarity and cohesion, that there needs to be something that unites the countries to act together in crises and conflict situations. And that requires a level of trust that everybody is going to pull their weight. And of course, in certain moments that creates political pressure on individual countries to act. And we know that we discussed the differences in size between US and Finland, which seem quite obvious when you think about it, but it's very important to prioritize that if something is an actual political priority for Washington, D.C., that of course will have a lot of weight for individual NATO countries. At the same time, I wanted to complement the previous question on are we tying ourselves to the US by saying that, of course, if you look at Finnish history, we have always tried to tie ourselves to a great power or regional power, whether it's the United Kingdom or Germany or even at some point France, which has not tended to end very well for us. Not that any of these options have, but that is the basic story of Finnish foreign and security policy, trying to escape our geography and political location and find cover behind larger powers. Of course, the situation in Europe is very different now than in almost any, or at least any point in our history, much better than it has always been. But this is good to remember as well.
But I think sort of the takeaways that I like to focus on, because I work with companies that invest in Finland, is that because of NATO membership, we are now seen as a safe, long-term investment. Kind of our profile is much better than it was before, which means sort of the economic growth potential that we have, but also the opportunities for R&D and for innovation that Finland has with all of our partners. And one of the great things also about joining NATO has been you mentioned that our thinking has changed. And now our decision makers, it used to be total defense of Finland. Now we're looking at regional defense, which means that we're working in a different way with our other neighbors. We're working, with the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Estonians, which we always had, but now it's very different because now it's regional defense. So it's not just also about working closer with the US, it's also working closer with our neighbors in a tangible and qualitative way.
Or you are, Alexander, bringing us to exactly the topic we are covering next. So really want to talk a little bit about trade and innovation and technology and the opportunities there. So I think you kind of started with our first question in part at least on kind of what the Ukraine war, the problems it brought us, and in a way how NATO has helped us mitigate some of those issues from a business and corporate perspective, the country risk, such things. But now looking forward, if we think about the mood among businesses and investors on both sides in the US and here, what do you think? How has the NATO membership really changed the calculus?
Well, the NATO membership has been game-changing for a lot of companies. Together with Business Finland in 2023, sort of in January, I think we released Finland as a Business Location Barometer. And so we surveyed 450 CEOs, chairmen of the board of half international companies, half Finnish companies on the profile. 56% of these companies were affected by the war in Ukraine. 56% of them reported, supply chain shortages, talent shortages, then also sort of the mental health of their employees, infrastructure issues, all sorts of things. And at the time, we hadn't made the NATO decision when the study was being done, not when we released it. But 69% supported NATO because of that. And now when we're in these discussions on investment into Finland, NATO has meant that people aren't talking about, well, if something were to happen, how do we remove our investment? Or should we invest? It doesn't enter into the formula for whether or not they should be investing. So it's really strengthened international confidence in Finland from an economic perspective and from an investment perspective.
Next one goes to Joel, I think, or Joel. Which one is it? I was going to ask whether we are more Americanized than ever before, but then our two Finnish panelists started calling.
Yeah, I think it's a bit hard for my surname to be too Americanized.
Yes. The United States was Finland's largest export partner last year. While Europe's economy is lagging, the US is chugging along, even though the election debates may not reflect this. At the same time, there is concern in the US about China's rise as economic power and Europe being sidelined on the global economic arena. How can Finland and Finnish companies and the Nordic countries more generally better find growth by riding the coattails of the US?
Well, I'm no economic expert, so I'm sure Alexander can correct my mistakes in the next answer. But maybe I want to start by saying that Alexander very well explained the plus sides of NATO membership on investment and trust toward Finland. At the same time, I personally think that when it comes to both Finnish companies and more generally European companies, our biggest problems are structural when it comes to capital markets and regulations. And by regulations, I do not mean what we usually hear, which is the saying that is now going around that the EU regulates and the US innovates. Of course, yes, to an extent that is true. But if you look at, for example, the technology sector in Europe, one problem is that there is no joint regulation for the technology sector. Each company or each country has their own regulations, and that makes it very difficult for individual companies to use the joint market that we have here in Europe. So we are not using our greatest advantages to our benefit. And these structural issues should be fixed. Now, when it comes to China, of course, one problem that we have as Europeans is that economy and security are so interlinked these days, and this is just a fact of life. So when we saw President Alexander Stubb visiting China last week, I think, he delivered very sharp messages on the war in Ukraine and on Russia to Xi Jinping. But that's the balancing act that we as Europeans are forced to make. At the same time, we are trying to make sure that the Chinese stay within certain limits in their support to Russia in their war in Ukraine. But if we push too hard, they might as well think that it no longer makes sense to try to uphold relations with the European Union, with the European countries, our trade, that they would have to de-risk their own trade relations with the Europeans, and maybe they would start providing actual military aid to Russia in their war in Ukraine. So this is a very delicate balancing act that we are forced to do. And of course, this is a bit difficult for US-European relations because US policy toward China is much more formulated, whereas we are fragmented, even though I think in the next 4 years, the next EU Commission will try to push for sharper language and policies toward China, also on trade.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about new technologies and security. One thing that we hear said a lot is when we talk about kind of cooperating around new technologies is that we cooperate with like-minded countries. This is still a term that is rarely very clearly defined or explained. And when we now look at especially kind of very emerging technologies with security implications, AI, quantum, such industries, what does that really mean? How do we balance kind of the security aspects and then the economic opportunities? Anyone can feel free to answer this, Laura, if you want to start, or Alexandra, if you're eager to take this one.
I immediately, while you were asking the question, was thinking of the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, who, I will admit, thought that they would be a little bit more active when it was initially announced. But one of the accomplishments of this council has been the agreeing of terms surrounding AI between the US and Europe. So I love that you brought up standards because I don't feel any less safe in my seatbelt in a car in the US than I do in Europe, but technically we have different standards for seatbelts. And that is something, that oh gosh, I'm about to say TTIP. I feel like someone needs to come slap me in the face, but okay. But that is the kind of thing that TTIP was going for. And the TTC, there are mechanisms in place for Europe and the US when it comes to new technology to agree what is it we're talking about? What is it that we're going to allow? What are those commonalities that we can agree on? And if that's the starting point, then wherever we get to from here is much better.
Yeah, I could just add that from the, when you think about the sort of US tech companies versus the European data protection, I don't see an easy solution for that. On an individual level, I've talked with many of the researchers foreign researchers who work at the Tampere University. They come from places like China and India. And the ones that have ended up in Finland have made a conscious choice of sort of prioritizing safety or nature or, good air and things like that. But if you look at most of the sort of tech workers of the world, they are lining up at the US border and not at the European border because they prioritize the high risk and high reward and the bigger pay. And when you think about it from a perspective of a tech worker, sort of thinking whether he or she would come to Finland or go to the United States, I mean, the ideal way of timing your life would be to get an education in Europe or elsewhere where it's government funded, then working like a maniac and getting a big pay in the US in your 20s, then moving back to Europe to have your kids, you know, and all the benefits that come with it, and have the safe environment for your kids and the school again, and then again moving back to the United States and working like a maniac from 50s until you retire, because then you get a bigger pay as well. So this would be like the ideal lineup between the safety.
That sounds like what I've been doing so far.
Yeah,
so
high risk and high reward, and then then you could also retire back in your home country, because by that time you would have worked in the US for at least 25 years, and you could afford a retirement anywhere. So this is from a perspective of a migrant worker.
Yeah, no, it's actually really great that you brought that personal level into this conversation as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that companies tend to be concerned about is when it's not about being against regulation. Regulation can be a very good thing. It's when you regulate before you have a chance to really innovate with something, before you have a chance to see where it goes. And you know, most people who are researchers or scientists or developers, they're in it for money, but they're also in it because they're going somewhere with it. These are all jobs where whatever they discover, the joy of discovery, and then the implementation and the commercialization of that discovery. And if you are in a, let's say, continent or if you're in the EU and your governments are trying to regulate it before you've even had a chance to see, does this have legs? How can it move forward? So then, of course, the US is sparkly and says, come figure it out here, and we'll give you labs, and we'll give you support, and we'll find you investment. What you mentioned about capital markets, absolutely a relevant question. And I will add that we know for a fact that both European and American growth companies that get transatlantic investment, they grow faster than companies who don't. So we want our European companies to get American investment, and we want American companies to get European investment, because that also then leads us on a much more positive track.
So what are the industries where we have most potential and where we can kind of make most of our closer ties with the US?
You asking me? Or
I'm putting this back to you, but I'm welcoming answers from anyone.
Sure. I mean, Finland very clearly leads in green technology, renewable energies, cybersecurity, digital innovations, emerging technologies like quantum, 6G, or future G, because some of our scientists are far beyond 6G already, and my brain can't comprehend what that actually means. Biotechnology, we're very strong in medical devices, so health tech overall. And I think that's, I feel like if I keep going, then it's just sort of like it's everything. But we are very strong in these niche areas that the US needs. The US needs this type of technology. And so there's a lot of potential there for us.
While we're on the subject of tech, and excuse me, I'm having technical issues here with the Mentimeter. Just taking up few panelists, few audience members' questions here on the subject of tech. And how would you comment on Elon Musk's involvement in the race and significance when it comes to the process and outcome?
Well, that's a different take on tech.
On the tech issue.
I'm gonna start on a lighter note again. I've often thought, X or Twitter, as it is formerly known, I think is a very good platform when it comes to networking with your professional grouping, such as researchers or journalists or even some politicians, and from around the world. It's a very good place to reach out to people with a very low threshold. But of course, the X of these days or today is very much different and more toxic than before. I've often thought about quitting X, but sadly Obama follows me on X, so it's a bit difficult for me to find a platform that has the same type of meaning for me personally, professionally.
Wouldn't he follow you on Facebook?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to try that. But yeah, when it comes to the question itself, I've tweeted this a couple of times, and nobody else except Obama follows me, so nobody has noticed. But I personally think that X should be banned in the EU area, not because Elon Musk is supporting Trump. That's fine. Everybody can support who they want. But because he's meddling with a lot of different countries as well, and also targeting nationals from other countries than the US who have nothing to do with the US electoral process. Basically anyone who he has a difference of opinion with, and he's using the platform that he owns, and which is a very significant place of or forum of public discussion to emphasize and lift voices that he personally politically supports and wants to have kind of a loud hearing across the Twitter space. And I think that's meddling with democracy in a very negative sense. That's something that we would not accept for almost anyone else owning a social media platform.
Yeah, I agree. It's become a very toxic place. And just like what I said about the headlines that get a lot of traffic if they have a negativity and fear, same applies to algorithms on X. So the dividing messages, the hate messages, they get a lot more exposure than the others. And that's why it's sort of become a little bit of a useless platform recently. I follow people there as well, but I've noticed that many of the professionals that want to have discussions and connections in their field have actually moved to LinkedIn this year, specifically because X has become so toxic.
All right, then let's bring it back to the topic of tomorrow and thus also of today. So the elections are upon us. Most of the topics that we covered today have a very close link to those, but this election, of course, also presents a big question of the health of the US democracy. So we have, of course, many of the same institutions here in the Nordics, here in Finland, but we also have some different challenges. So a couple of years ago, a study on how citizens view the health of their democracy showed that only 1 in 5 Americans are satisfied with the state of their own democracy. This in Sweden, which was one of the countries included in the study, was 60%. And that is quite a big difference. And this kind of American discontent and concern and distrust will likely also show up tomorrow at the polls and how this election, and not only the election, but also the transfer of power will play out. So how worried should we be? Not just about tomorrow and the next few days, but also in what do we get to witness along the path to the White House from the election? Laura, you get to start. You followed many US elections, both from the American side and from this side of the Atlantic. What makes this election different or unique, or is it just one more of the same?
Well, I have 2 points. First of all, I do think that this might be the most consequential US election for Finland since the end of the Cold War, specifically because of what might or might not happen to the future of NATO. If Trump is elected, he doesn't have to pull United States out of NATO to actually affect the future of NATO. If he keeps on the sort of a rhetoric of we won't support Europe, or Europe is not worth defending, or you're not doing enough, and therefore we won't do that either, that will of course affect the country risk in the eyes of the international investors. So in that way, this election is crucial. However, even if Harris is elected, I don't think that Finland or any of the NATO countries can just sort of go, that was close, let's move on like normal. Just like with what Joel and Alexander were saying earlier, the long-term view of the United States is the pivot to Asia, and their resources and their attention will direct towards China in the long run anyway. So that means that Finland and European NATO allies will have to bear a bigger responsibility of NATO's investment than before. Second point about the democracy in the United States. Even though Americans are very discontent, of their democracy and of their politicians, you have to look at the Gallup numbers about their own lives. I just recently compared that in the spring, about 28% of people in the United States were happy about or content about their democracy. However, about high 70s, low 80s, 80% of Americans are actually happy with their own lives. And that has remained the same since 1970s. So when you only talk about the Americans' attitude towards their governments, you see only half of the picture. Because people there are so individualistic that they might be very unhappy with their government, referring to what Alexander said in the beginning, and very happy about their own private lives and the lives of the people around them. So it is a split picture. We should not be as worried about Americans' own lives as we should about the development of their democracy.
Right now, it's estimated that 66% of Americans who are eligible to vote are highly motivated to vote in this election. And believe it or not, that's a high number for the United States. I mean, we've seen elections where it's barely 50% of people who vote. So 66% of people willing to vote is quite high, which, you know, without how tight this race is or how expensive these campaigns would be, that in itself is something that indicates that democracy is alive and well in terms of how people feel about going to vote. And I will note that, you know, the U.S. Elections, it's not always easy to vote. So when you have a high number of people willing to vote, they're really willing to vote. You know, you don't get the day off if you're working to go vote. So you can't necessarily leave your job. Polling stations might be quite far from your home. You have to figure out how to get there. Each county, not alone each state, but each county has a different metric for what they need to vote. So you can vote some places. You don't even need ID to vote. Some places you need 2 forms of ID to vote, and it's very specific on what forms of ID you need. So the fact that 66% of the country are willing to kind of get informed about their own county and where they need to go and make plans to get there and possibly take time off work is a good indication.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I'm going to start with the bilateral relationship, which we already talked about some, and then move on to the broader transatlantic relationship and the aftermath of this election, or possible aftermath of this election. First, we discussed the Finnish-US relation, and we also heard from the embassy before in the beginning that the relationship is very strong and historically so. And I don't foresee any bilateral issues as such. Of course, you know, certain topics might arise when it comes to China, or certain crises can happen, as Laura said before. That's always the case when it comes to diplomacy. That's normal. But bilaterally, the Finnish-US relationship is strong and will remain so. But unlike a lot of people in publicly have said in Finland, or publicly seem to believe in Finland, as I mentioned before, most oftentimes DC is not thinking about Finland. And if broader issues arise between US-EU policies or US approach to the European Union, such as a trade war, as we saw in the last Trump term, or between US and NATO, or US and Ukraine when it comes to the end of the war in Ukraine. That will, of course, obviously also affect Finnish security and Nordic security and the security environment here. And there's little that a country the size of Finland can do in that type of situation. But now moving on to the broader European picture, when people ask me, what's the plan B? Do we need a plan B for the possible re-election of Donald Trump? No, I think we need a plan A. And plan A should be that we should have spent the time that we have had and the time that we have remaining investing in our own defense, not only in this country, but jointly together as Europeans, and making sure that in any scenario that happens, regardless of what happens in the US election, we have the capacity to continue supporting Ukraine in their war against Russia, even in a scenario where US would cut back on their own support to Ukraine. But this has not happened. We have basically wasted the time that we have had because most European countries have been focused on their own bottom line, thinking that if we do joint investments in the European defense sector, for example, then the French industry and the German industry benefit, and countries such as Finland don't get the money and our own domestic companies suffer. Well, that's fine, but if we say that the war in Ukraine is existential to us, then the word existential, as far as I see, means that it's regarding our own existence in this world. And so whether we spend 100 million more or 1 billion more shouldn't really matter, but that's not the case. And I want to just finish by saying that, so we have agency, we still have time, we could do things, but I don't see any political will to do those things. But some people in Europe are now saying, if you look at what the European Commission is doing to prepare for the US election, they're saying we have a Trump working group that's preparing for a trade war with the US. Well, I'm sorry, but we have a war going on in Europe. And Donald Trump is a transactional politician who believes in leverage. And as long as our security is dependent, not only in this country, but in Europe generally, on the US willingness to support us, as Laura said before, and not create any gray zones or gray areas or increase the risk of misperception in Russia. I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation here. There is no world that I can see where Trump would say, okay, we have a trade war with Europe, but we're still covering their asses in all these other sectors and continue to support Ukraine. That's not going to happen. So we have serious increased risks, but we also have agency. And of course, as we have mentioned before, we do not know the end result of this election, so there is no reason to be pessimistic as such. But I think it's good to be aware of these things and think about the possible pathways of action that we have in this country and in Europe generally.
No, go ahead, then I'll go.
Well, just a little. I agree with you completely. I think the challenge is to sort of convince countries like Portugal or Spain or something like that the war in Ukraine is existential to them as well. It's easy for us to say here on the eastern flank of Europe that Russia is a great threat. They are not seeing it the same way, and I'm wondering how could we create that kind of a scenario for those countries.
I completely agree, and you're completely right. But I mean that we're not spending the money either. We're spending it nationally, yes. But Finland, for example, has always been and still is against joint debt for defense spending in Europe, in defense industry. And this is still the case. So, and we are not, I haven't seen any new initiatives coming out of Finland, even though we are very worried about the pathway of the war in Ukraine. But I still agree with you.
I'm not sure what the bridge I should do from that. That was, that was
no,
incredible.
You did your own thing.
But one of the questions you asked is what happens now. I just want to, what happens, the election night is coming, and it is highly likely we will not know the results in a normal time schedule. However, anytime Trump or President Trump is in the spotlight, unpredictable things happen. It could be a landslide either way, but it is very, very close to call. We know already that there will be recounts. We know that some elections, and I don't have them written down here, but we've had elections where we found out the results in finish time by 8 a.m., but we've also had to wait till Saturday. We've had to wait till December 13th. The Saturday after the elections till December 13th. It is highly unlikely we will definitively know who the president will be. So then we are all waiting on tenterhooks, and the U.S. is recounting votes, and we know that the motions to recount manually have been rejected, so maybe those recounts will happen faster. One of the things we also know is the last time, or the last election where President Trump won the election, he was not prepared for his transition. So we know that it was sort of scrambling. November 9th, he's there thinking, okay, now I've got to put together a cabinet. And the president of the United States fills around 5,000 positions. It's like 3,000 to 5,000 depending on the makeup. It's not just those most senior posts. A lot of really key positions run by him. And that's something that will end up impacting us, because who the USTR is, or who the Secretary of the Treasury is, and how they, what kind of pressure gets put on the Fed, all of these things impact us here in Finland. So one of the things that the pundits in DC tell us that Trump has done some planning this time, right? So that some of these positions, they know. So that transition will maybe be less chaotic if he is the one elected. But then after that sort of period of less chaos, we know we're in for a completely unpredictable presidency, and we know that there is a high likelihood of tariffs, of strongman leadership, shall we call it. And we know that President Trump likes to make a deal. And so there are many locations that deals can be made right now, and how that ends up, I'm not sort of a geopolitical expert, but from those sidelines, those are areas where he would probably get involved. And then President Harris, Vice President Harris, if she becomes President Harris, very similar, we're looking at a far more organized transition period. However, we also know that last time when President Trump lost the election, we know that he rejected that loss, and we are likely to see more of that as well. But also her positions, the positions that she would put in place will be ready earlier as well. And overall, that would be a more predictable start to a presidency.
So overall, a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, both in the days to come, but also in the weeks and months to come.
Well, Laura was right. I mean, there is a form of entertainment in the whole thing as well. It's daily updates.
Yeah. At least X won't be a boring place in the next weeks.
I said in the beginning that sort of a fear and chaos create interest. So here we go.
And let's see what our audience has been interested in. Yes. Would you like to bring us a couple of questions from the audience?
Absolutely. I was just going to tie in a few I think could be if Harris wins the US presidential elections, is there hope of getting TTIP back on the table, of deepening collaboration between the US and Europe? I noticed TTIP mentioned earlier on the
I think I love the fact that TTIP has yet to die. It's sort of like TTIP is, I go to DC every year for door knocks. Every year some form of TTIP takes place. I think what we would be, one of the newer things that I have heard is a digital version of TTIP. So like the TTC has been discussing AI, that what could we do with digital service trade? Except for last year, the 3 previous years, Finnish digital service exports to the US grew year on year in double digits. Last year it grew in single digits. I was disappointed, but still it was growth. And so that would really behoove us here, is if we could get something like that off the ground. But otherwise, alas, I do think TTIP is not going to happen. But I am ever the optimist. I will keep pushing for trade and for a pro free trade agenda.
One of the questions we got from the audience in advance had to do with Arctic cooperation, and you touched on that before as well. If we look at either scenario of outcomes of this election, what do we see? Are there differences to be expected in how Arctic cooperation, also including Canada and us Nordics, will move forward?
Well, a wild guess, I would say that with President Harris, the environment in general will be put more into the focus, and with President Trump, it will be more sort of a trade and maybe security-focused Arctic area. But about the protectionism, I think both Harris and Trump have to take the interest of the American industrial workers very much into focus. And as we've seen, I mean, Biden actually didn't cut most of the Trump's tariffs. There was a wave to European tariffs, and I think that wave was temporary. So I think it expires, is it next year or year after? So then we see if Harris wins, whether Harris is willing to actually waive the tariffs, or whether she will, put up some tariffs to Europe. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible, because President Biden didn't just, finish with them. He just put a sort of a temporary waive on them.
Do you want to pick the final question of the evening, Anton? Is there one that speaks to you the most?
There's one about who is going to win, but
Let's steer clear from
yeah,
that.
steer clear of that one. Unfortunately, we'll let the American people decide. Concerning the elections, how worried are you about the prospect of foreign actors or states influencing the election outcome by covert information influence operations? Who feels brave
We're
enough
ending
to
on a scary note here.
No, I was going to say that I've maybe more worried about foreign interference in Moldovan elections or European elections. Of course, there will be interference in the U.S. elections as well, but I think Americans are well able to do their own disinformation operations when it comes to election campaigns, and the weight of foreign disinfo ops would likely be of limited impact, in my personal opinion. Just also because the U.S. authorities are more prepared than they were in 2016 and are more aware of these things happening. But this being said, of course, we are aware that the Iranians, for example, have been trying to impact the elections and have tried to hack the Trump campaign and Harris campaign and whatnot. So there are a lot of things happening, but I don't think it's going to be the main driver here.
I think more dangerous is sort of the division within the United States media, and also maybe the ignorance also that some people get their information from the internet, so to speak, and do not really recognize what are the trustworthy sources and what are not.
And you have to understand that a lot of people have, it's almost like an anti-partisan vote, where they believe according to, or they share values with a political party, and they're voting not for someone but against someone else. So maybe they're voting for Kamala, Vice President Harris, because they're voting against Trump, or maybe they're voting for President Trump because the scary progressive politics of Vice President Harris concern them. And I think that all comes into then the media they're consuming. And so we know from 2016 that there was some Russian interference, but then that was also determined by that investigation that wouldn't have changed the outcome. So, we would expect that they would keep trying, and that we would hope that the predictions here would hold true, that regardless, the United States will elect whomever is the next president.
I see that we still have 2 minutes, so I'm trying to make an effort to end on a slightly less intimidating note. So, Joel, you made the point about the Nordics kind of having more weight behind their actions and their policies if we work together. And we also talked about a bit of a momentum there, interest toward the Nordics. So if the Nordics and Finland as part of that bloc wanted to make one thing a foreign policy a priority vis-a-vis transatlantic relations and the US for the next 4-year term, what should that priority be?
That is like the single largest question you have asked.
Let's have a speed round.
Maybe a PhD.
I mean, for me, it's got to be commerce. We are nowhere if we're not growing our economy, if we're not helping our businesses thrive. So every policy we can do to make Finland a more attractive place for American investment and to help our Finnish companies enter and succeed in the US market, that's what we've got to focus on.
Excellent. Joel.
Well, in this country, the only correct answer is Ukraine, but I'm going to ignore that and presume that that's the answer and say climate instead.
Well, I think I agree with both of you, but if I have to come up with a third one, in Finland in the United States is known to be a technologically very advanced country. So I would create an initiative circling around AI and somehow sell it to Americans and cooperate with them with that.
We can help with that.
That sounds good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a great conversation, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Kiitos. Just take talked about.
Yeah.